Okay, so today I'm going to be breaking down some shots from a short documentary I shot last year called Hot Shop. If you haven't seen the full project, please go watch it. The full video is up on my YouTube channel. So the first shot I'm going to break down is the interview frame. And initially we wanted to shoot inside the actual workshop here that's behind our subject in order to just have the most control over the lighting. But the furnace here actually couldn't turn off, and it was really loud, so we knew we had to pivot and shoot outside, which is really like the name of the game when it comes to filmmaking, is having an initial plan and then it not working out for some reason and just being able to adapt. So our lighting setup for this is pretty simple. We're only using 2 lights. Our key light is an Aperture 1200D. Forgive me for my terrible drawing. It's a 1200D. And it's hitting our subject here. And it was pretty bright that day, so we were really maxing out the output on the 1200D here. But as you can see, it's just giving a nice punch on his face. And then we have a 6x6 duvetine here, 6x6. And as you can see, it's just adding a little bit of contrast on the other side of his face. Since we're outside, I guess I could have just used the natural light that was coming in, but it really just kind of made him look pretty flat. So I think this here kind of made him look a little more three-dimensional and stand out from the background. So in the close-up here, you can see what this 1200D is doing better. It's just giving him a lot more punch on his face, and it's giving him a bit of an eye light here, so it just makes him stand out a little bit more. And then next we have a 600D here in the back, and it's just shining some light on the background so that the background doesn't just fall into total darkness. And the funny thing is, you can actually see it here. That's the C-stand, and we're just blocking it with the flag. Initially we were troubleshooting because we were trying to get it in there without seeing it, but my gaffer just made a really good point, being that if we kind of covered it with the flag, and since there's just a lot of metal kind of stuff everywhere because it's a big workshop, you wouldn't really notice what it is, and it kind of just blended into the background. And I think if I didn't point it out just now, no one would really know that there's a C-stand there with a light. And we actually left the 2 overhead lights here on, mainly to bring some more ambience into the background because it was still pretty dark. But I actually think the 2 lights here bring a lot of interest into the frame, and kind of same with the furnace light here. It just adds a bit of interest with these lights on. So for the composition, initially, like I said earlier, we were planning to shoot inside, but we had to pivot to shoot out. And originally I had our subject here a lot farther back. It just looked really boring, the background kind of looked like mush and you couldn't really tell what it was. So we actually pulled him forward, and I think it just created a lot more separation and depth. And what I like here is that we kind of have a frame within a frame. And I think that just looks really nice, and I think that even helps separate him more from the actual background. And another thing we opted to leave on was this fan here. I thought it just brought some interest into the frame, and it wasn't too distracting or took away from our subject, so I thought it was a nice touch. I think this shot here is a really good example of having a location that does a lot of the work for you. So as you can see here, this big open garage door is just flooding in tons of natural light, and that's pretty much our key light for this. I do have a light playing in this scene. It's the 1200D again. So 1200D. And it's just giving us a bit of wrap on his face and his body, just so he doesn't fall into a silhouette. And as you can see, it's pretty bright out here, so you really need a light with a high output in order to pull this off. And honestly, the 1200D was just enough to do this. We were using it at max output the whole time. So ideally, if the circumstances were perfect for this scene, I would have waited for the sun to make its way over here, just so it would be backlighting the background instead of front lighting it. If I was able to backlight the background here with the sun, it would have just looked a lot nicer and would have looked a lot less nuclear like it does in this scene. Also, I wouldn't have to rely on so much output from my 1200D if the sun was back here, because I wouldn't have to try to match the exposures. But that's just kind of the name of the game with documentaries, is you don't get a lot of choice in that matter a lot of the time. We had a very specific time slot when we had to shoot the actual glass blowing process. So I couldn't afford to wait for like 4 or 5 hours for the sun to get in the right position. So like I said earlier, for all these scenes here, we were lighting it using one light, and it was the Aperture 1200D with a light dome. But initially I had a different plan. So initially I wanted to shoot the 1200D through like an 8x8 fabric, just to create like a massive key light, and that would cover a lot of ground as he was like moving around the studio. I also wanted to rig a backlight here, just so I could have something shining on him to kind of separate him from the background a little bit. However, once I saw the actual glass blowing process, I knew none of that was really gonna be possible. First thing, the studio gets like really hot, so I didn't want to have like too much equipment around just like for fire hazard. And then Paul was really moving around the studio at a very like high pace, so it just wasn't really practical if we had like a huge frame. It really just would have gotten in the way and would have disrupted the glass blowing process. So that's why we just opted for a 1200D with a light dome, because it was like the smallest setup that could get us the best results. And if I could go back, I definitely would have rented a roller stand for the 1200D, just so we could move it around easily as he was running around the studio. So you can see in the close-up here what the 1200D is actually doing. If I didn't have a light here, his whole face would be pretty much a silhouette. The 1200D is really giving me like a nice wrap, and it's giving me a bit of an eye light here. Ideally, like why I wanted an 8x8 frame was it would give me even more wrap that would kind of end around here and give me an eye light in his other eye. But I think with the tools we had, this did a pretty good job. So the next thing I want to talk about are the shots where I didn't use any additional lights at all. So for the scenes where I was visiting Paul in his home with his family, I knew I wasn't gonna set up any like additional lights or grip gear or anything like that. Number one, because it was just me there, so I wouldn't have enough hands to operate the camera and set up lights and all that. And secondly, I really just wanted to feel like a fly on the wall, and I wanted them to feel as comfortable as possible. And just like setting up lights and all that, I think would have felt a lot more invasive. So I just opted not to do any of that. However, there are still some things I did to shape the light the best I could in that situation. The first thing I did, and that you should always do when going into a location, is I turned off all the overhead pot lights that were in the house. Yeah, it's no secret, overhead pot lights look really gross. They cast really bad shadows, and yeah, you should turn them off. And as you can see here, it was a pretty sunny day outside, so a lot of natural light was flooding in through the windows, and it was actually casting some nice light on our characters here, as you can see in his daughter's face and on a bit of his face as well. So for the scene here where Paul is cooking with his daughter, I actually opted to turn on one of the overhead lights. As you can see here, there's a big window and it's flooding in a lot of natural light. You can see here it's like hitting the back of her hair. But kind of where they were positioned in the kitchen, I wasn't getting really any output of light on their face. So I actually turned on the overhead oven light, and it was kind of just bouncing off the countertop, and it was giving her a nice light on her face. Obviously, it's not as controlled as I would want to, but for this kind of situation, I think it gave a nice look. And it actually gave me a little bit of color contrast in the scene, which turned out to look pretty nice. For this scene, Paul was looking through some old photos. So I just opted to put him right beside this big window because it's giving me a nice big key light here. And it's giving me some nice wrap on his face. and some nice contrast here. Ideally, if the situation was different, I would have probably brought in like a bounce just to give a little more return on the shadow side of his face here. But again, I think for this type of situation, it's a pretty nice look. And I really think for documentary work, it can be as simple as just putting your subject beside a window and pressing record. I'm gonna break down some of the stylized plan shots we had for this doc. So for this shot, it starts in darkness. I'll show the full clip. It starts in darkness and then Paul turns on this fire torch and it illuminates his entire face and body. Beforehand, I knew I wanted to use some sort of practical light in the studio to light our subject. And obviously, since this was a glass blowing studio, he had a fire torch. I thought this looked pretty cool, and I think what really pulled this together was starting from complete darkness and then having the fire torch turn on and then like reveal Paul in his studio. And obviously this kind of stylized shot wouldn't work for every documentary, but that's kind of your job as the cinematographer, is to figure out like what visuals can really support the story. And I think in this case, the shot really worked well to help tell the story. The next shot is the outro shot here. So Paul pulls down the garage door and all the light here kind of escapes the studio. And again, it's kind of a similar concept as that last shot where it starts with light in the studio and then it's like a practical element taking the light away. And I just thought that was like a cool visual to show. So we actually do have a light playing here in this scene. It's the 1200D and it's blasting into the ceiling just to give a little more ambience to the studio, just because when he closed the garage door, it was just like a little too dark for my liking. And I just wanted some more information in the shadows just so I'd have more to play with in post. So that's it for this video. If you liked it and learned something from it, please comment, like, subscribe. It really motivates me to keep making these types of videos, and I'll see you in the next one.